So the Experience Agile Week is already in its 8th edition and brings to Lisbon 3 different events between the 23rd and 27th of September. So the week starts with the World Agility Forum, leading the topic of Agile leadership for the digital age. So it's an event focused on business leadership, innovation, marketing, and customer experience. Then we transition to the Agile Human Factors, which focus on human behavior, the culture, the team climate, and system design. And finally, we close the week with the Experience Agile, the first event that created the whole week, which is an event that enables you as an attendee to gain new skills and experience by participating in learning activities with speakers and peers. Here are some of our speakers that will support us during that lovely week. So we have Brian Rivera, Delia McGabe, Carlota Perez, Simon Wardley, Dave Snowden, Rita McCraft, Steve Dang, also enter Hastings, and many others. So early bird is open at this moment. Please go to experienceagileweek.org to grab your seat. Also, as a webinar attendee, you have around 10% of discount. Tickets are running out, so hurry up. With this out of the way, we are now about to start. And during the session, so feel free to use the Q&A section, for any questions, and I'll gladly relay those questions for the panel. With no further ado, I now welcome Steve Denning to present our speakers from today. So Steve, the stage is yours.
Thanks, David, and happy to be with you today. Our topic, the economics of Agile, is one that did not exist when I joined the Agile movement 15 years ago. We gave no thought to the economics of Agile. Agile was not launched by economists. It was launched by pragmatic software developers who were figuring out what worked in practice. And they assumed, as I did, that because this was a better way of doing things, it would spread automatically to the firm. The whole organization and the whole firm would become agile. That didn't happen nearly as easily or as quickly as I had hoped. In the last 5 years, as we now have trillion-dollar agile organizations, it's a little easier to make that kind of an argument, but it is true that the theory of management and economics and accounting has often been at odds with what we have discovered in the practice of Agile. And we have been steadily reinventing those theories as we go along. And today we have 2 speakers who are at the forefront of this process of reinvention, particularly the economics of Agile. Our host is my colleague, my friend, and my economics teacher, from whom I learn everything I know about economics, Hunter Hastings. He is one of the rare distinguished economists who also, thank God, has extensive management and practical and entrepreneurial and marketing experience. He's a leader in the effort to rethink economics in the light of what we've learned. And he's published 5 important books on the subject. He's joined by his colleague, Fernando Madero D'Andrea, who also stands at the intersection of business and economics. He holds degrees in economics and management and marketing and production, and he has extensive management experience in Europe and Latin America and elsewhere. So we are privileged to have these 2 leaders, global leaders, in rethinking the economics of Agile. And so without further ado, let me turn to Hunter and Fernando.
Very good. Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Steve. I have to share my screen here, so let me do that. It's still clunky on Zoom. That's something that could be made more agile in the future. There we go. So hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm Hunter Hastings from the Mises Institute's Economics for Business program. Fernando, you want to say hi?
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for the kind presentation. I'm Fernando D'Andrea. I'm currently a PhD student here in the US, but as Steve said, pleasure to be here and to share some ideas on how thinking about proper economics will help you and your company to be more agile. So Let's go.
So our topic today is economics, and we expect among our audience that might seem like, as Steve hinted, is not a great fit with Agile. So we're assuming you're all Agilists, that you're in business or associated with business one way or the other. And we're assuming you're all value creators. And that's the way we want you to think about economics. Economics is the science of value creation. It's the logic of value. So we often think about economics, if we read about it in the online or watch it on TV or see commentators talking about it. It's an old-fashioned, big, slow, lumbering kind of science. It talks about slow-moving aggregates like GDP or the employment level and those kinds of things. It's a science of statics. So it takes snapshots and then figures out where we could be in a year's time or some future time. It tries to predict. It tries to mathematicize with models. Our economics is nothing like that. Our economics is entirely different. It's relevant to Agile. It's about flow. It's about speed of change. It's about learning. And we hope to explain that. Do you want to emphasize anything there, Fernando, about economics?
Yeah, the only thing that I'll add to this is what we are going to discuss here is directly applicable to your businesses. So what we want to do, what we want to convey to you is that if you have the proper economic understanding, your businesses will be better.
So that's the first point we'd like to make, is that economics is embedded in business. Business is embedded in economics. If you're in business in any way, you've got to be an economist. You've got to understand the kind of economics that we're talking about. So economics is highly relevant to business, is fundamental to business.
Yeah, on that, again, to come back to what Hunter was saying, if you think about the kind of economics that we are discussing here, we are discussing an economics that is focused on the consumer. So it's in this way, it's very in line with Agile, because we are thinking about how can the economy provide, how can firms provide value to the consumer? And in the end, the consumer is the one that decides what's valuable or not. So that mindset shift between I will serve you with what I have and I will serve you with what you want. It's a different approach to economics, right? So that's the idea here. Value is in the mind of the consumer. Okay, so value is created by the end consumer in a connection between the means that the company has and the ends that the consumer wants to have. So you guys, as companies, as managers, you have to understand what the consumer wants to then be able to provide that. Go ahead, Hunter. Next part here, please.
Well,
so again,
just emphasizing the flow, that this is a radical concept that value is created by the consumer. And that could be the end user if you're in a B2B business, your customer.
Yeah. So, sorry about that, Hunter. One thing that is important is even if you are in a B2B business, you have to understand how your product will be used and how it's useful for somebody that is consuming it. So always think about how valuable your product or service can be. And to come back to finish up these points, one important thing is that value is created in a system of collaboration between the producers, okay? And this system of collaboration will, step by step, the different producers will be adding value propositions to the products and services. Finally, to come back to the consumer side, the consumer is learning all the time about what is valuable or not. So if you think about 25, 30 years ago, having a mobile phone was not valuable. You have to carry like 5, 10 pounds of stuff around to have a mobile phone. Today, that's way more valuable. The same thing happens with food, with transportation, with everything. So value is a learning process. Go, Hunter.
So that brings us to our first loop. We're going to talk a lot about loops, and we want you to think about economics. We want to think about agile as a never-ending loop. And you can start these loops anywhere. We'll talk you through the value learning process loop. So let's start on the left there. We as a business know perhaps what our customer goals are, their preferences. They've got some previous experience with us. We've got some data about that. We listen to them as entrepreneurs and firms. And as Fernando said, we get the idea that we can make a value proposition. A value in our thinking is an increase in well-being. It's more satisfaction. It's a better circumstance than the prior circumstance. People are always looking for better. They're always looking for improvements. And that's what value is, the feeling that I've realized that improvement. The value proposition is processed by the customer. So again, if you're in B2B, this could be a buyer at a company that's a client of yours, or if it's a consumer, it could be any kind of product or service consumer. And they look at it and they say, is there any value here at all for me? That's kind of a binary decision. Relative to other choices I could make, including doing nothing, is it better? What's it worth to me in terms of money? That would be an exchange value. As I use it and experience it, how does that feel? And then I step back and I assess it. That's where feedback happens to the agile firm. So now you can restart that whole loop process because the customer's gone through a value learning process. You can go through a value improvement process with a new value proposition. So you want you to think about value as a process, a collaboration, a back and forth between you and the customer. It's not static, it's dynamic.
And this is why Agile is so important for businesses, because you incorporate that perception of the consumer, that value idea, that value learning of the consumer within your business. So the next step here is to realize that people see reality in a different way. So you do have lots of information outside. You do have lots of data that you can assess. But you guys, as entrepreneurs and managers and the consumers, you see reality differently. So people believe that this thing is better, and the same thing could not be better for other people. So this subjective interpretation of reality is very important. And the other side of the coin here is the entrepreneurial judgment. So you have the reality, but the entrepreneur, the individual, or the function of entrepreneurship, as we will discuss later on, means to interpret that and decide and act. So subjective interpretation of reality is about the information input and the entrepreneurial orientation. So I have some information and I'll orient my business in this way because I believe that's the proper way to go. And the judgment of the entrepreneur will decide and act on what I have understood from reality.
So that brings us to our second loop, which is at the business model level. So what we're going to show you is generic, but think about this as a business model for your firm. So you've got the observations that Fernando talked about. That could be data, it could be surveys, it could be feedback from the customer, it's your interaction with the environment, what your competitors are doing. You've got observations, you've got data that you can use, qualitative and quantitative. That goes into your company orientation. So not only is the customer's view of reality subjective, each seeing it in their own different way, a company's way or an agile team's way of seeing reality is different. And this orientation is very, very complex. We can come back and explain it another day if there's any interest, but it includes the mental models that your business is working on. It includes the business models that you use. It includes the influences and culture. Maybe you had a founder 20 years ago who shaped your business in some way, and that's your culture. It's the tacit knowledge that your engineers have that they've developed over the years. It's the way you do creativity. So every firm is different, and every firm is subjective. And Fernando and I were trying to think of some relevant examples of that. One that might be relevant is, I was thinking about Porsche and Mercedes. Porsche thinks about itself perhaps as a design company. They design cars. They also design many other things as well. A lot of their manufacturing is outsourced. They design to very tight specifications, and then they can control the production methods without actually owning the factories and the productions. That's one way that maybe Porsche and Mercedes have different interpretations of reality. They have a different orientation. You got any more like that, Fernando?
Because, like, again, Mercedes sees the word different. The data is kind of the same, but they look at the word and say, no, we have to control everything. We have to have not only the design, but the factories, the engines, the everything. So these connections are different. The way that you interpret the word is different. Think about, again, businesses such as Netflix and Blockbuster 25 years ago. They were doing exactly the same thing, but Netflix was sending people movies, while Blockbuster wanted people to come in and pick up the movie. So they see the reality and they act. They have a business approach that is different. Again, the subjective interpretation of reality, what is going to be valuable to the consumer, is different depending on how you look at things.
So you're feeding this data through your orientation. The second point we'd like to make about this is you must be constantly reorienting, checking your mental models, checking your business models, checking how you're creative, checking if your culture is right for the external environment. So constantly reorienting is one of the methods here, which changes your intent. So a bit of a fancy term there, intent structure, but don't think about goals and plans and strategies, but you do have an intent. You have an intent to create value in a certain way and do that for customers. Intent limits the number of experimental decisions that you can make. So traditionally, planning and strategy has been just one or two or a very few number of decisions. You make them at the beginning of the year and then you execute them. Agile obviously changed that because it's constant feedback. And so think of a business as a set of decisions and then a set of actions based on those decisions. Decisions are hypotheses. You don't have to be right. You just got to run a lot of experiments. And then action is activating your intent. And that's when you generate feedback back to new observations, which you feed back through the loop. The goal is to do this as quickly as possible, to reorient as flexibly as possible, and to be as responsive as possible to the feedback loops. One of the terms that's used in systems thinking is explore and exploit. And Fernando and I don't like that. We like explore and expand. So the decisions that you try are explorations. Run as many as you possibly can, then expand the ones that seem to be working, that seem to have good customer response, discard the ones that don't. And that's the replacement for planning and strategy. It's explore and expand.
Okay, so again, to come back to what we were discussing earlier, we looked at the firm, and now I'm going to try to show you a little model of what the firm, an agile team should be. You start with the customer value. So what the customer wants. You need to understand that. And to do this, you need what we call the entrepreneurial function. What we have here, entrepreneurship is not one individual necessarily. It's a function of the business that is responsible for understanding the consumer at all times and constantly to help to co-create, to innovate with the customer. Okay. After that, after you have that kind of understanding between the entrepreneurial function and the consumer, you have another level that is more a firm level thing, which is the marketing of the firm. So how does the firm will propose value to this consumer based on the understanding of what the consumer finds valuable? And the marketing function here is very important because the marketing function will be the one spreading the word about the consumer to the other functions. So if you think about your business background, you have like the silos, right? Marketing is a silo, operations is a silo, people are a silo, and finance is a different silo. So this is not the way an agile company should work. Again, you all should be guided by the understanding of the entrepreneurial function that is spread around in the firm by marketing. And operations, finance, and people should be guided by what marketing understands that needs to be done to propose value to the consumer. So this model here is the model that represents an agile firm that you can actually implement in your businesses. Are there in all industries, not only in software development ones?
Yeah, so there are a couple of examples that might illustrate this, Fernando. Steve Denning told a story in one of our meetings about Satya Nadella at Microsoft, and he has implemented an entire agile change. And he talked about bringing customer value inside the firm, which is what your model represents and requires here. And one of the ways he did it, I'm sure there are very many, but was changing the discussion of a lot of marketing and sales meetings from how many units have we sold and how many dollars or francs or lira did we bring in revenue, to what's the consumer thinking? How are they liking our software? What do they use most in terms of features? What do they complain about? Are there new creative things we could learn about consumers? So we changed the culture that way by bringing the customer value inside the company. And that's one small example, but it's illustrative.
Yeah, just to complement that, Hunter, I was watching this yesterday. There's a Node, like 25-year-old interview by Jeff Bezos, and it's like a 2-minute interview. He mentions the consumer 20 times. Mm-hmm. And he says that we should not be thinking about the short-term financial pressures of the company only. We need to understand what the consumer wants and how we are better able to propose value to him. So this is what the model is about. So bring the consumer in the company, in the discussion. Whatever you do in the organization is or should be directed at benefiting the consumer.
There's another piece of terminology that is starting to get some airtime now that I think began in the Chinese company Haier, or may have begun somewhere else, but it's the phrase zero distance from the customer, trying to get the entrepreneurial units of the business to think of zero distance to the customer, bring them inside or go to their houses and see how they're using our appliances and so on, but have no distance. That's a nice illustration, I think, of the idea of bringing customer value inside the firm. So we've talked about value. We're going to make 6 value propositions about how economics can be useful for business. But I think the first point, Fernando, is this is not your father's economics, right? This is the right kind of economics. How would you describe that?
Yeah. So for all of you listening, I would like you to think like this. Economics is about people. It is about relieving people's dissatisfaction given a limited amount of resources. So when you think about economics and how economics can help your businesses, it is because economics is about people, is about the value that people are looking for at all times, given a limited amount of resources that they have. So your job is to say, hey, this is great for you, and to present something that is actually great for the consumer, and to show him or her that this specific thing will improve their lives, will reduce their problems. So that's the point. And I think, again, Agile and economics have a lot to contribute, a lot to dialogue on this thing.
The second suggestion that we would make is we call it think meso. So you may have heard the term microeconomics, which tends to look at individuals and individual decisions, maybe individual firms. And you might have heard the term macroeconomics, which is about the economy at the national level or the global level or the regional level, but the macro of GDP and so on. There's a level in between. It's called meso. And economists are beginning to think about this. It's the structural changes that go on in the economy, like the current one with the shift from physical to digital. That's creating all kinds of shifts, creating new ways of doing things like e-commerce and cloud computing and so on like that. What are those structural shifts? Think like that, because those kinds of things are going to affect the way that your individual firm can fit in. Another way of saying that is institution. So we're seeing the institution of money change now, maybe from physical to digital, or maybe it's going to go in the blockchain. Maybe Bitcoin will survive and thrive, but institutions are changing. We've got a publication coming out shortly called The New Emerging Institutions of Entrepreneurship. We think institutions are going to look at more networking and less structural. We think big business might be a thing of the past, but think in that way. Think of markets and ecosystems. How are you innovating? Are you innovating in your market where lots of people are collaborating, or are you trying to do it separately? Carlota Perez, who's one of the stalwarts of the World Agility Forum, talks about S-curves of capital surging through the economy, both financial capital and production capital. It starts slowly, then it accelerates, and then maybe it peaks. You've got to watch that. You've got to think about how that's happening. So think meso is the second point.
So yeah, to wrap up pretty much everything that we said, start about understanding value. So bring the consumer into the firm, into the company. When you do that, and you are to a certain extent doing it when you do agile development and agile thinking. When you do that, when you bring the consumer, everything changes. The firm changes because now you have a clear goal, which is understanding the consumer and serving the consumer or the customer, depending on how he feels about it. Okay, so think about value as an experience, a feeling. Something that the consumer will have to deal with every single day in many cases. So how does it feel for the consumer to use your product or your service? Is he being happy, or he's like, okay, I have to use that very bad software or that very bad company all over again? Value is a learning process. So think about that. The consumer is always learning. So if you stop and you are not adding more stuff and you're not getting better, somebody else will be doing it, and the consumer will learn that and will migrate from you to some other supplier. Value is individual. You cannot say that everybody feels the same about their product. So again, if you have a very big business with lots of different customers, you have to find a middle ground to serve most people. But do not forget that value is individual and value is comparative. So when I decide to go to the movies, I am automatically deciding not to go to the football game because they are at the same time. And I'm comparing two different things. Or I decide to buy a wine instead of buying, I don't know, beer. Or I decide to go to a party instead of staying home. Value is comparative. So your business is not in the business of competing against the same industry kind of thing. You are competing against everything else. You have to bring more value than other businesses to your consumer. Finally, there is quantification of value, but that's subjective. People look at your product or service and they say, this is valuable for me, this is not valuable for me. But it's kind of impossible for you to assess this quantification because it happens in the mind of the consumer. So if you think like that and bring the consumer in, you will be able to continue to improve your businesses because you're focused on the consumer, okay?
The next point we could make is about entrepreneurship. So this is a difficult word. People think about entrepreneurship maybe differently than Fernando and I do. So maybe we've got to ditch the word, but let's stick with it for the moment. Entrepreneurship is a function. It's not an individual. It's not a small firm. It's not a startup. It's a function. And Fernando described the function. It's the function of listening to the customer and then turning what you hear into value propositions, which you can then test and you can get in the loop and improve value. So all firms, big and small, need to have an entrepreneurial orientation. And so that includes some of the things we talked about today. Decision and action replace strategy and planning. That you do things, you experiment, you try, you see what works, you use the feedback loops. Resource recombination is one of the things that we talk about a lot. You've got lines of code, you've got machines, you've got the cloud. Are there ways to put those together in a new way? You don't have to invent something new, but maybe a new process. I think online shopping is an example of a new process. Everything in online shopping existed the day before it was invented. It was recombined into a new way to deliver value to customers. What we call value agility. Experimentation. Don't worry about things being wrong because there is no wrong. It's all trial. There's no error. And so keep doing that, keep using the feedback loops, and try to think about how you can have an adaptive organization. The bigger companies get, the more structures they have, the more silos, or as Fernando referred to them, silos. The more of that you have, the less agility you're going to have. And so how can you change structures internally so that the feedback flows through the firm without impedance? So think about entrepreneurial orientation at every size of business and in every division, every department.
To complement that, you have to rethink the firm. So if you put the consumer value at the core, you're going to be needing to change and to be dynamic at all times. And to build upon what Hunter was saying, you have to erase the boundary, the limits between your organization and the other ones. Big organizations will have a hard time dealing with very dynamic environments. So smaller organizations, more agile organizations that can organize in a distributed production process will be able to modify and to evolve quicker than their competitors. So think about the ecosystem. Think about how you can build upon others' specializations to get a better business.
Now, final point, and this is something that's fundamental to our brand of economics, is think flow. Think of the market as a flow. Think of your business as a flow. Think of your product and your team as a flow. And one of the analogies that's often used is the river. You never step in the same river twice. Every run of a complex system is unique. So think about that. Think about how you do continuous change. How can I bring that inside my company to do continuous change. It's very challenging. One of the ways to do it is to think about time, and that speed of learning is the ultimate competitive advantage. But then you have to implement that learning. So how can I change my implementation to reflect the learning that I just got from my feedback loop? And that's the point about organization. The feedback loops must flow. Experimentation must be the norm. Anything that's structural is a barrier, and we've got to try and remove that. So just to sum up, we're running out of time, I think, here. Fernando and I would say that Agile is the implementation of economics inside your firm. So he talked about subjective value and gave you a description about that. I think, Fernando, we find that that's the hardest thing for business people to implement, right? The subjectivism of business.
Yeah, that's a problem, because the businesses tend to be very objective. What are the goals? How much money do we have to make? How many sales do we have to close, et cetera, et cetera. This is a problem, but we have to find other ways to measure or to follow what is happening with the consumer that are not necessarily numbers. You need to do that because the consumer is always changing, and the numbers are looking at the past, and your company should be looking at the future, not at the past.
The next point then would be to think about the Meso level. We think in terms of complex systems. We think of the structures and the markets that are in the middle of those systems. They're nested, they're networked, they're connected. How do we fit into all of those different kinds of systems? We talked about the adaptive entrepreneurial model. Obviously, that's a rich and complex set of thoughts, but the point is that your orientation, your firm, your team is subjective, and you need to understand that, adapt it, change your orientation as time goes on. And then finally, firm and market as a flow. So I think we've probably used our time up to leave a few minutes for Q&A. So Fernando, sum up for me.
Yeah, so I think the thing that we want to convey here is you guys should be thinking economics for your business. And economics is about bringing the consumer to the core of your discussion. If you can do that, and if you can implement the changes, the structural changes needed in the business, I'm pretty sure you'll be more successful than you are by doing very similar things that other companies are doing. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. And please, if you have any questions, let us know.
Let's send it back to David. I think he'll manage the questions for us.
Thank you, Fernando and Enter, for this lovely session. Well, it's a topic that is crucial to be discussed and understood during any period, especially the one that we are living as we speak. And we have a couple of questions. I think we have 7 questions so far for you to go through, and we have 15 minutes. Let's see if we can go through them all. So looking here on the chat, we have one question regarding, are these brand of economics spreading in mainstream economics? That's one of the questions from Steve Denning.
Hunter, do you want me to say something, or do you?
Well, we can share it. The answer is yes. So the question involves a little bit of economic history, and economics has gone through a series of different ways of thinking. But now this complexity economics, or what Fernando and I call Austrian economics, or it's just modern economics, it's real economics. It's a new science. The whole science of systems and systems thinking is about 50 years old, and it's making a huge difference. Thinking in systems as opposed to narrow disciplines is changing. So yes, the world is coming along, maybe slowly, but economists are beginning to understand that, and they're beginning to understand value creation, as Fernando described it, the customer first. And so, yes, this is the new economics. It's not mainstream economics. We think of mainstream as as old and historical, but it is the new economics of today and it is spreading. Yes. Fernando?
Yeah, I'll just add one thing. You can see lots of these developments in mainstream mainstream entrepreneurship discussions. In economics, a little bit less, because economics is, if you think about it, it became like very mathematized science, and as you all know, it's very hard to predict and mathematize and put numbers to customer evaluation. So if you want to like dig upon the mainstream of it, you can look for the entrepreneurship literature, entrepreneurship journals, and stuff that are working on that, and that's pretty widespread in entrepreneurship, I can tell you.
Good. Perfect. We have another question here regarding what do you think is the best way to estimate the value generated by Agile?
Wow, that's a hard one, Carla. Estimate the value of Agile. I think what I would do is I would start by comparing similar businesses, one that is implementing Agile methodologies and the other one that is not. I'm pretty sure you find that the ones that are implementing Agile are more responsive to the consumer and are more, I hate that word, but more resilient to what is happening in the economy. So think about, I was listening to Horace Sutherland's interview with Hunter, and he said that supermarkets in the UK were not as hurt by the pandemic because they had already before learned that they had to deliver groceries to the consumers. So they were listening to the consumer before the world blew apart, right? So I think this comparison could be nice. It's easy to do it in software development, not so easy to do it elsewhere. But measuring Agile, that will be hard.
Let me just build on that, because the question of measuring value is a really interesting one. And what we have to get inside our heads is it's not a number. So is measuring value hard? Yeah, maybe it is, but customers do it every day. Consumers do it every day. Should I buy this? Should I buy that? There's qualitative parts of that and there's quantitative parts of that. So that's the first step, is we called it subjective quantification. Figure out the numbers, but also figure out the feelings of value, because they're equally as important. And then the second point I'd make is that one of the huge components of value is the removal of barriers, not necessarily innovating with something new, but making something easier, faster, more convenient. It's to hand, it's user-friendly, it's intuitive. I would look at Agile in that element. How many barriers does it remove? How much increase in speed? How many more innovations do we get into the marketplace? That's the way I'd think about it. But combine quantitative and qualitative is the trick.
Regarding that question, there is another question from Jason, which is quite similar to this one. And Jason is asking, I'm longing for actual economic modeling, an example for a team or a company of teams. For example, what does a sprint cost? What's my expected return on a release? That's what Jason wants to know about it.
Okay, I'm going to jump on that because I worked with that for a long time. So we are not saying here that you should not measure costs and stuff like that. What we are saying is cost depends on value. It doesn't matter if you have very low costs if you cannot sell your stuff, if the consumer is not willing to pay for what you are offering. So the idea of you should flip the understanding of costs. Cost is a function of value. If you understand the value that you're proposing, then you can create a cost structure. It's not the other way around. The other way around is an early 1900s idea. So I will build a factory. It's going to cost 50 cents to produce this T-shirt, and I'm going to sell it for 75 cents. That's not the way we should be thinking today, because consumers are, again, they have access to millions of different products. And just because you have a very nice cost structure, it doesn't mean that you're capable of offering something that is valuable to the consumer.
Yeah, we didn't get to talk about capital today, but capital is a value, as Fernando just said, and its value is the flow of revenue that's going to come from the customer in the future. And you discount that backwards. And so think of your sprint and your team as capital. And are you going to expend that capital on this particular sprint or another sprint? Well, how much customer value will it bring in the future? And you can test that customer value by going through the learning loop that we talked about. Is it going to be valuable to the customer at all? Relative to other things, will it be more or less valuable? Can I guess at what kind of revenue it might generate? What's their experience if I run an experiment or a test? And what's the feedback loop? So think of it dynamically, but if you go through the customer learning loop and do it from the customer's point of view, you can make that decision.
Perfect. We have 6 minutes more, and a couple of questions. So one of this question that we have is, let me check here. So during the latest years, growth, engineers, and marketing are key areas to support the discovery and the delivery of new products. Nevertheless, economists are not people that, as far as I know, are involved in this context. How do you see economists being brought into work inside early stage and even later stage startups?
Yeah, we were talking the other day about economists in business, and they tend to be forecasting next quarter's GDP or something like that. And that's the wrong way to think about economists. So economists should be people like Fernando. They're thinking about customers. They're thinking about how value is created. They're thinking about ecosystems. They're helping your innovations fit in. They're talking about the value creation process. So we would certainly favor economists being brought inside at that earliest of stages. But as we said in the very first slide, everybody in business should be an economist. It's not necessarily a siloed and separate discipline, but it's a piece of knowledge, it's a piece of expertise, it's a way of thinking that should be embedded at the very earliest stage. So I'd go find yourself some economists who can do that.
I'll just add one thing. The economists that deal with the more macro ideas and where is the economy going and stuff like that, they might be important for some very big businesses. They are important for some very big businesses because they look at trends and big societal changes and stuff like that. But 99% of the businesses are not like that. 99% of the businesses need to look at the consumer, and the GDP of 2023 is not as important for these businesses as the consumer that needs to be pleased in the next week, day, or month. So I do believe that there is a role for economists within firms, and depending on the type of firm, there could be a more macro guy, more mainstream guy, but I do believe, like Hunter said, that everybody in businesses should be using the economic way of thinking and putting the consumer value in the center of the discussion.
Thank you. Another question that I have here, and I believe that you mentioned during your presentation, but the question we have is, what could be a first step for a company to become closer to customers? How should these relationships with customers be mediated?
So there's a very simple answer to that. Talk to them. And one-on-one conversations with customers are the ideal unit of analysis and interaction. Maybe you can watch them do what they do because their actions are maybe more important than the way they talk about their actions. But talk to them, visit them, go into their offices, go into their homes. There's a fancy term for it called ethnography, but you don't need to do that. You just need to talk to customers. When I was in the consulting business and we used to try to solve problems at the highest levels from some of the most complex technology, the unit of analysis was to go talk to the customer. How does it feel to be doing what you're doing today? How would you like it to feel? What are your hopes and fears? What are your concerns? So just talk to them. And that's different from a survey. I'd avoid survey data as much as possible, but it's not different than behavioral data. So web stream clicks and behavioral data of that kind of stuff are useful if you can deduce how customers are feeling. But I would say talk to them, get behavioral analysis and make deductions from there, put the two together if possible, certainly avoid surveys and that old-fashioned kind of market research.
Just to add one thing, remember Satya Nadella. Numbers are important, like Hunter said, the numbers will be important, but how is the customer feeling about my product? So if you cannot do that, you are trying to sell to numbers, and numbers don't buy, people buy.
Perfect. Good answer. We have time for one more question, and this one is the following. So the nudge concept was popularized in 2008 by Richard Taylor, if I believe, and maybe I'm late to this conversation. How do you see these patterns during the last 2 years? I believe about the pandemic, something like that.
So I'll take an extreme point of view here. I hate the nudge concept. And the reason why is actually twofold. One is that it comes from a kind of economics called behavioral economics, which assumes that people and customers aren't very smart. They make the wrong decisions and the wrong choices, at least in the view of the experts. So nudging is nudging them in the direction that the expert thinks. Fernando and I come from a different practical discipline, which is let behavior bubble up from the bottom and the market will figure out, or people's interactions will figure out what's right. So we're inherently not in favor of that nudging. And then at a higher level, that becomes policy. And we would take the point of view that the words economic and policy should not be combined together. There should be no such thing as economic policy, because as Fernando said, it's all about customers and how they feel. I don't know whether did I go too far, Fernando?
Just to add one little thing, that doesn't mean that you should not be using marketing management to inform your consumers about the benefits that they might achieve by using our product. So if you think about nudging, quote unquote, as like informing your consumer and trying to make him decide to buy your product, to try your product, I think that's a good contribution. But I would sign down what Hunter said. It is very complicated to put the decisions of thousands of people, millions of people, in the hands of one decision maker. What is good for me is not good for David, should not be good for Steve, and Hunter has a different opinion. So yeah, let people decide and try to make them decide in favor of you using marketing management techniques and stuff like that, but let people decide.
Perfect. So we reached the end of our time. Nevertheless, I'll have one last question that our audience is eager to know more about. So Enter, what would you like to say to everyone at home that is thinking of joining us in September during the Experience Agile Week? What can they expect? It's for Enter.
Well, Agile Week is really exciting because we try to explore and present this kind of advanced thinking. Steve Denning has gathered just some of the most impressive and powerful thinkers in the world about business. They're on the leading edge of all of these kinds of developments. You get to talk to them. It's not one of those conferences where you get lectures and you have to listen. It's much more interactive. It's much more discussion. There are workshops to join in, and there's lots of mingling. You get to talk to people like Rita McGrath and Daryl Rigby and so on that are the leading thinkers in this area. So think of it as a different kind of conference. It's an experience, and experiential learning is the best kind you can have. So you're going to have just a fantastic experience at Agile Week. We can't recommend it too highly on that ground.
I'll just have to add that you will learn something about value. So your value scale will change when you do that, when you learn like that. So it's the value, it's the value model that we showed you in work. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. So, like I was saying, we reached the end of this session. But and talking about Rita McGrath, we have more webinars coming up. We have another one on July 13 with Rita McGrath, a best-selling author, speaker, and a longtime professor at Columbia Business School. And she's widely recognized as the premier expert on leading innovation and growth during times of uncertainty. So for you that you are attending at home, an email will be sent shortly with more information about how you can register to this webinar. So once again, thank you for attending. Thank you, Fernando, Hunter, Steve, for this lovely hour, and see you very soon during the next webinar, and I hope in Lisbon between the 23 and 27 of September at the Experience Agile Week. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, David.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.